For many people, Christmas is the most wonderful time of the year. I hope it is for many of you. And it has been as much as I can remember my whole life. It's the most wonderful time of the year. And it's kind of, I have to be reminded sometimes that it's not that way for everybody. That for some people, Christmas is the worst time of the year. In fact, according to the National Institute of Health, Christmas is the time of year that has the highest incident of depression in our country. And you can understand that for a lot of people who are alone and they're seeing other people gathering with family members. It can be a very difficult time and a hard time to get through. And yet, when you look at the Christmas story, one of the themes that you see from beginning to end is joy. I want to take a look at this today and look at not only the fact that joy is central in the Christmas story, but joy is available for people even when the circumstances are not perfect and not good. So first I want to just show you two Christmas passages where joy is a central theme. First one is in Luke chapter 2, of course, and we're going to just read verses 8 to 12. And I want you to hear what the angels had to say. And there were shepherds living out in the fields nearby, keeping watch over their flocks at night. An angel of the Lord appeared to them, and the glory of the Lord shone around them, and they were terrified. But the angel said to them, "Do not be afraid. I bring you good news that will cause great joy for all the people. Today, in the town of David, a Savior has been born to you. He is the Messiah, the Lord. This will be a sign to you. You will find a baby wrapped in cloths and lying in a manger." So that's the first passage where the angels announce great joy for all people. And then we come to Matthew chapter 2. And this is a passage about the wise men that you just were singing about. And we're going to read just verses 9 to 11. After they had heard the king, they went on their way, and the star they had seen when it rose went ahead of them until it stopped over the place where the child was. When they saw the star, they were overjoyed. On coming to the house, they saw the child with his mother Mary, and they bowed down and worshipped him. They opened their treasures and presented him with gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. So the angels announce great joy. The wise men are overjoyed. But there are a lot of people who aren't feeling that as they go into Christmas this year. In fact, the circumstances for thousands of people are maybe as bad as they've ever been this year at Christmas time. I think about all those people out in California who've had their houses burned to the ground with these fires that are still raging out there. And they showed people just recently being allowed to go back to the neighborhoods and finding that their houses, with all of their Christmas presents and all their decorations, everything has been reduced to ash. And I wonder how they would feel if you say, is this the most joyous time of the year for you? It's hard for them to experience joy. And of course, right here in Florida and in Texas and in Puerto Rico, there are thousands of people who are still displaced from all the hurricanes that we had this year. People whose homes have been destroyed, who've lost their jobs, and who have lost loved ones. And it's going to be hard for a lot of those people to find joy at Christmas time. In fact, right here in this church, we've lost some loved ones this year. It's been a hard year for us as a church and for some of our families. And we're going to go through the first year without a loved one in their home. And they're going to be wondering, how can I have any joy at Christmas this year? In the New Testament, we discover something amazing about joy. And that is that joy has nothing to do with your outward circumstances. It's a common misunderstanding. We confuse it with happiness. And happiness has everything to do with your outward circumstances. But joy does not. For example, in the New Testament, it talks about Jesus, and it says, "For the joy set before him, he endured the cross." I'll be honest with you, it's a passage that has fascinated me for years. This is Jesus anticipating the suffering on the cross, the physical, emotional, and spiritual suffering he's going to go through. But it says, "For the joy set before him, he endured the cross." Certainly not because of great circumstances, but there was joy even as he went through that suffering for us. When Paul and Silas were beaten and thrown into this horrible, dark, filthy dungeon, at midnight they were heard singing. And the joy of the Lord was in them in the worst, most darkest circumstances you can imagine. In fact, later Paul would write from prison and he would say, "Rejoice in the Lord always." And again I say, rejoice. And by the way, in that little phrase is a key to understanding joy when your circumstances are not good. He says, "Rejoice in the Lord always." That little prepositional phrase, "in the Lord," is the key. You're not rejoicing in your circumstances, because your circumstances may not be good, but you're rejoicing in the Lord, that even in the darkest times, the Lord is with you. And so you can rejoice in the Lord all the time. And he says, always rejoice in the Lord. In James, he writes to us, "Consider it pure joy, my brothers, when you face trials of many kinds." Now, I think most of us would finish that sentence, "Consider it pure joy when everything is going well for you, when you have a good job and good health and everything's great with the family." But he says, "Consider it pure joy, my brothers, when you face trials, tribulation, difficulties of all kinds." In the Bible, the word joy, some form of it, joyful, rejoice, joy, is used in 400 different verses throughout the Bible. Now, some of those verses talk about celebrations, like in a marriage celebration and rejoicing there. But many of those verses that talk about joy talk about the difficult times. In the Old Testament, they talk about the captivity when they were carried off into Babylon and Assyria, and when they were living as servants and slaves. And they talked about a joy for an anticipation of a time that was to come in the future when God would set them free. And I think in many ways that's a great picture of what it is like for us. When we live here on this earth, sometimes the circumstances on this earth are not conducive to joy. But we look forward to a great delivery in the future, when God takes us to the promised land and takes us to a place where there will be eternal joy in his presence. And that's what we see in the Bible all the time, is they're anticipating this future deliverance. When David wrote Psalm 35, he was looking at a time when in Israel when life had been difficult and there had been many defeats and there were all kinds of problems. And he wrote in Psalm 35, verse 5, I think we have this one for you. Yeah, right there. "For his anger lasts only for a moment, but his favor lasts a lifetime. Weeping may stay for the night, but rejoicing comes in the morning." I want you to remember that when you're in that nighttime and when you have that weeping in the nighttime. It's when it hits many people, when the activity of the day ceases and you lie down at night and then all your troubles start to come on you and all your sorrows start to come on you. And there's weeping in the nighttime. But David says to remember that rejoicing comes in the morning. I love the fact that he says the anger lasts for a moment, but the favor lasts for a lifetime. C.S. Lewis talked about how our entire lives on this earth is just like the preface of a book. And when you die and go into eternity, that's when the real story begins. That this time on this earth, which seems like a long time to us, is just a brief moment in time. And then we have all of eternity with God. So the difficulties that you're going through right now, they last only for a moment. But the blessings of God last forever and for a lifetime. In that same chapter, in Psalm 30, David wrote this in verse 11. "You turned my wailing into dancing. You removed my sackcloth and clothed me with joy." He's talking about God taking him from a place of mourning to a place of great joy. And I want to tell you that that's possible for you. If you're going through mourning in this lifetime, you're going through mourning right now, that God can do the same thing for you he did for David, was to remove the sackcloth and clothe you with joy. What David knew, because he knew the heart of God and he was called a man after God's own heart, he knew that the worst thing was never the last thing. And that's important for you to remember when you're going through the worst thing, that when you're a believer in God, that worst thing is never the last thing. Jeremiah also talks a lot about mourning. He's actually been called the weeping prophet because God gave him an impossible task. He told him to go take this message of judgment to the people of Israel, to tell them if they didn't repent, they were going to be captured and enslaved. And sure enough, he even told Jeremiah, they're not going to listen to you, but you have to take the message anyway. So Jeremiah took this message of judgment. The people rejected him. They abused him, and he was known as the weeping prophet. And this is what Jeremiah said. This was the message from God. I will turn their mourning into gladness. I will give them comfort and joy instead of sorrow. And so you see this theme in Scripture of going from mourning and weeping to comfort and to joy. Throughout history, God has taken the worst circumstances and He's brought something good out of it. I think many of you know the name of Lee Strobel. Lee Strobel was a devout atheist when he worked for the Chicago Tribune. He was a reporter for the Tribune. Later on, he went on to write books like A Case for Christ and even A Case for Christmas. And in that little book called A Case for Christmas, he tells a story of one of the people that had a profound influence on him while he was an atheist that had an incredible impact that led him eventually to Christ. He was assigned, when he was a journalist for the Chicago Tribune, he was assigned to write a report on this family that was struggling financially at Christmas time. We see that all the time. They do it on the news, they do it in the papers. They highlight families like this year, families that have lost everything in a fire or a hurricane or whatever. And oftentimes the readers very generously provide money and gifts and food and all to these families. And that's exactly what he did. He went to this inner city family, and he found the Diego family. And there was a 60-year-old grandmother who had this wonderful name of Perfecta. That was her name. And she had two granddaughters that she was raising, Lydia and Jenny. Both of them had lost everything in this. They lived in this little roach-infested tenement, and because of a fire, they lost everything, and they moved into this tiny two-bedroom apartment. And when Lee Strobel went in, this is what he said. He said, as I walked in, I couldn't believe how empty it was. There was no furniture, no rugs, nothing on the walls, only a small kitchen table and one handful of rice. That's it. He said they were virtually devoid of possessions. In fact, 11-year-old Lydia and 13-year-old Jenny owned only one short-sleeve dress each, plus one thin gray sweater between them. When they walked the half mile to school through the biting cold, remember this is in Chicago at Christmas, Lydia would wear the sweater for part of the distance and then hand it to her shivering sister who would wear it the rest of the way. And then he said, despite their poverty and this painful arthritis that kept Perfecta from working, she still talked confidently about her faith in Jesus. She was convinced that God had not abandoned them. And he said he never sensed any despair or self-pity from these people, not once. So Lee Strobel wrote an article just describing what he found in this family, particularly their poverty and their need. And he said when Christmas Eve came around a few weeks later, he couldn't get that family off his mind. And their belief in God really stuck in his mind because he kept hearing all of these songs and all these people talking about Jesus. And he is a devout atheist, but he heard them talking about Jesus, and he hears Christmas about Jesus, and he says, I continued to wrestle with the irony of the situation. Here is a family that had nothing but faith, and yet they seemed happy, while I had everything I needed materially, but I lacked faith, and inside I felt as empty and as barren as their apartment. Isn't that a great picture? They had nothing except faith. He had everything, but without faith, his life was as empty as their apartment. I thought that was an amazing description. So he had a slow news day shortly after that, and he decided he would go look up the Delgados and see what happened to them. And he walked in there, and he was amazed at what he saw. The outpouring of generosity from the people of Chicago who read his article was overwhelming. He said they had given him, they'd filled the furniture filled the apartment with furniture, appliances, rugs, a Christmas tree, wrapped presents, bags of food, a large collection of warm winter clothing, and a generous amount of cash. These people went from having nothing to having abundance. But here's the thing. He says it wasn't the gifts that shocked him when he saw it. It was their attitude toward the gifts, their response to the gifts. This is what he said. As surprised as I was by this outpouring, I was even more astonished by what my visit was interrupting. Perfecta and her granddaughters were getting ready to give away much of their newfound wealth. When I asked Perfecta why, she said, our neighbors are still in need. We cannot have plenty while they have nothing. This is what Jesus would want us to do. Now, Lee said if he had been through the poverty that they had gone through, he would have hoarded all of that to keep them through the next season. But their first instinct when people were generous with them was to be generous with others and give it away. And it just completely changed his thinking. So he asked Perfecta, what did she think about this generosity from all these people? And this is what she said. She said, this is wonderful. This is very good. She said, we did nothing to deserve this. It is a gift from God. But, she said, it's not his greatest gift. No, we celebrate that on Christmas. His greatest gift is Jesus. And Lee Strobel, this profound atheist, is listening to this, and it was just, he couldn't understand. He said to her, this child who was lying in the manger was the undeserved gift that meant everything. That was the gift. And he said at that moment, there was something deep inside of him that desperately wanted to know this Jesus.
Amazing grace.
He saw how powerful it was. He saw Jesus in Perfecta and in her granddaughters, and he wanted to know that Jesus. Later, he would come to receive Jesus, and he would come to receive and understand the peace that they had. And that empty life of his was filled to overflowing when he finally found that indescribable gift of Jesus. Some people will experience great joy this Christmas. There are other people who never experience joy because they make a choice. They choose to complain rather than to rejoice. There are people who are whiners. Saturday Night Live had a whole skit about a family of whiners, and that's all they did. No matter what happened to them, they would find something to complain about, and they were the whiner family. And they were so annoying, it was hard to even get through the skits. But nobody likes to be around whiners and complainers. I've heard people say to somebody who's going on like that, do you want a little cheese with that wine? Stop doing that. We don't like to be around people who complain. But that complaining is often a learned behavior. Their parents were probably complainers, and that's all they heard growing up, and they became like that. And their grandparents were probably complainers, and that's where their parents learned it from. But every day you can choose, and you can make a choice. Henry Nouwen said this, joy does not simply happen to us. We have to choose joy every day. You ever think about that? Every morning when you wake up, you have a choice. You can complain about your aches and pains, and we've all got them, and they're getting worse, I have to say. We can complain about our financial situation, or our health, or our family, or whatever we want to. We can always find things to complain about. Or you can choose joy. I want to tell you about a pastor in Tennessee, in Memphis, Tennessee. His name is Shane Stanford. I have a picture of him. That's him. Shane Stanford had some terrible things happened to him. He was born as a hemophiliac. And as a hemophiliac, he had to take regular transfusions of blood his whole life as he was growing up. And when he was 16 years old, after one of his transfusions, they discovered that the blood that had been given to him was tainted. At that time, they were just learning about AIDS and HIV, and they were just learning that HIV could be transferred to people through blood transfusions. And after he had received a blood transfusion and got very sick, the doctors tested him, and they said, Shane, we're so sorry to tell you this, but you've contracted HIV, and you may only have a couple more years to live. And he was 16 years old at the time. His grandfather took him aside and said, Shane, what has happened to you is bad. There's nothing good about it. What's happened to you is awful. It stinks. And he says, you could choose to just crawl in a corner and moan and complain for whatever days you have left. And he says, I wouldn't blame you if you did. I'd probably join you in there and complain with you. But he says, you don't have to go that route. He says, you have another choice. He says, you can choose joy. And you can choose to live every minute of every day that you have and make the most of every day that you have, because you may not have many days left. He says, I hope you make this choice. And Shane made that choice because he thought he didn't have many days left, so he decided he was going to make the most of every single day that he had and not take them for granted the way most of us do. And his life changed. And he became joyful, and he became positive, and he made an impact on a lot of people. And he didn't just have 2 years to live. In fact, he's still alive today. And he's a pastor of a church. And he wrote a book. I have the book cover here by Shane Stanford called Making Life Matter, Embracing the Joy in the Everyday. Embracing the Joy in the Everyday. Now here's what's so amazing. God took something terrible in his life, his hemophiliac, the AIDS and HIV, and because of that, he changed his focus in his life. Most of us, when we're healthy, we think we've got forever in front of us, so we waste a lot of days. We don't make the most of every day, and we don't always find joy in the everyday things of life. But he did. He was forced to by this terrible thing that happened, and God used it to make it the best thing that ever happened to him, and he has had an influence on thousands of people because of that. We have the same choice that he had every single day. We can crawl in a corner and complain, or we can make the most of every single day that we have, and we can choose joy. And it's my hope that this Christmas, that every one of you, every minute of every day, you'll make the most of it and choose joy in the everyday, that you will trust God and you will find God wholly present and wholly true with you. Let's close in prayer together.